Sounds good to me. I can hear you fine. So, all right, sounds good to me. As long as y'all can hear me fine, I'm gonna keep going. Um, Welcome everyone. We're going to do 2 hours today as an introduction to smart home with a focus on energy control. So, the reasons why we'll get to in class. So we might as well just dive in, and you'll learn more about me and how I use smart home technology in my practice, which is primarily solar design. I'm not really a smart home guy. I'm a solar installer who found himself doing smart home stuff to improve the value of on-site renewables, and then I discovered there's applications for energy management that can be even more valuable than solar and batteries. And so the smart home with an emphasis on electricity management, and I say smart home, but I'm really saying for home or business, um, can be a great starting point to approach smart technology, and even a good starting point if you're thinking about on-site renewables or storage to collect some data and optimize the value of whatever project you end up moving forward with. But there are some pitfalls. So, one safety topic, and I don't think it's worth the time to pull up the video link, but over the holidays, this YouTube link went around of basically it's a kid's bedroom, and someone hacked the web camera monitor inside the bedroom to talk to the kid, and the guy was pretending to be Santa Claus and was telling the kid that he didn't care if the kid was naughty or nice, and the kid could pull all the curtains off the walls and destroy the room if they wanted to. And that scared a lot of people. But it turns out that this particular instance, it wasn't a hacker per se. It was someone who already had access to that user's email and password. So that's one big security issue with smart homes, is there's a lot of password management, and that if you give out your password to other people, or if they know your password from using the same password uh, for other accounts, then that's a security flaw. No matter how good a security you do, ultimately, if you give away the keys to your house, someone can get into it. Now that said, um, there was at the same time there was another glitch where a smart security camera system that was a cloud service, people would log in to the security camera service, and during startup for a brief period of time, they would actually see the security feeds from other users' cameras that weren't their own. And so you pull up your security camera software, and for a half a second, you see someone else's security camera before it switches to your own. And that's obviously that's a privacy concern. And Google's response was to yank the manufacturer's camera system from their network. And so, 99% of the users out there were not either experiencing or concerned about, a momentary blip of someone else's camera feed. They want their doorbell to work. But all of a sudden, these doorbell cameras and security cameras got yanked from the platform, and all of the users lost the usability of their products until the manufacturer was able to perform a software update and patch the issue. And that kind of brings itself to a discussion of cloud services versus local services when it comes to smart home management. Cloud services where there's a third party manufacturer who's really, selling you the hardware cheap so that they can sell you subscription services on into the smart home experience. There are some real advantages to that business model. It's convenient. So when you buy a cloud service versus setting up your own local service, setting up your local service is more technically difficult. And we'll be going through those steps at a very high level today. Sometimes the smart home platform that is put out by a cloud service provider is more stable or more functional because they have that profit motive to deliver a finished product. Whereas when you're putting your own functionalities together, you're trying to take all these nuts and bolts and spare parts and assemble a greater system. If you don't do it correctly, that could be a less stable system. So, even though you could potentially lose your services with loss of an internet connection or loss of the manufacturer support, on the other hand, while those services are working, they can be more stable than just hacking together your own solution. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, and especially when we're dealing with consumer grade products and not hacking a do-it-yourself project together, the cost of the cloud services can be less than the equivalent cost of building your own local network. So there's users who embrace the cloud and say it's inevitable and we're going to focus on internet security. And then there's users who say, under no circumstance do I want Amazon or Google spying, or Apple or whoever spying on me, some manufacturer I've never heard of. I don't want them spying on me, so I'm going to create my own local solution. And sometimes that costs a little more money, takes a little more time, and is a little less functional. But what you gain from that local solution is a fundamentally more secure system. So we think. Some negatives of cloud services is the company could go bankrupt. And there are cloud service devices where a notable one would be Lowe's with their Iris system, but there's others. Best Buy had went into smart homes and then discontinued their product lines. And then if you're buying into a subscription model, or you're relying on outside software to deliver functionality, if the company goes under or gets out of that business, you might lose your functionality. And then there's loss of internet connection. That's one thing that Google and Amazon are working on right now is their devices have always had internet required. And now they're trying to enable some of their devices to work offline as well locally. But that's not uniform across the board. Of course, how often do you actually lose your internet? Well, I don't know. It depends on the level of smart home technology you want to implement. If you want to implement a energy management system that might have some backup power management functions, then that begs the need for that communication to occur locally so that it can operate in backup power modes as well as when things are working as they should. And then just with a cloud service, these smart homes can be hacked. Smart homes is making your home into a computer. And so you are creating opportunities for hacking as well as, bringing added value into the home. And with a cloud connection, you're trusting a third party company with that data, and that data could be hacked on the cloud side of things. And just like we saw with the Santa Claus issue, you can also have hacking occur, on your side as well. But to some extent, cloud services are inevitable. Amazon and Google are very far ahead on voice command services. There's other premium smart home companies like Sonos. They make a smart home speaker system. They bought a company that was focused on local voice commands called Snips. So now Snips is no longer available because Sonos wants to put their own voice command system into their platform. Stanford has a voice command service called Almond that's a little bit more privacy oriented, but fundamentally, like heavy voice command services require more computing power than what your local network is capable of. So if you want maybe just for a few voice commands, a local voice command service would be great. But as we get more comfortable with voice command services and we expect our computers to do whatever we tell them to do, whether it's a privacy oriented third party voice command service like Almond, or the ones you're more familiar with like Amazon or Google, that's probably going to be a cloud service. And voice commands are valuable. They promote health, safety, and welfare. They also promote laziness. You can get into bed and then say turn the lights off rather than actually go and flick the switch on your wall. Which to some, it might sound a little ridiculous. Why do we need that function? Well, once you start using that function, it's wonderful. Like I with my television, I tell my television to turn on and off with my voice. Now I don't need to worry about where my remote control is. It's just turn on the TV and then I stream from my computer, whatever. It's voice commands are convenient. And then there's other people who, from a disability standpoint, they have a stronger motivation to see voice commands coming, because for not all people, just getting out of bed and turning that light switch on is an easy option for them. So there's so many different ways you can go with smart homes. One kind of emerging market is allowing the elderly to live in their homes longer, because the computers can automate some tasks that just provide a little bit more accessibility to the building. And then kind of on the so how does this it's better start loading, or I'm gonna have to cut one of my streams. But so how do you get voice commands networked into your smart home system? It actually is a lot easier than you would think. You don't need to do much programming. Basically, if you have a cloud service, as long as it's compatible with your smart home hub, you go into the hub and you say, allow permission for Google or Amazon to communicate with the hub. And then you might have to go to Google or Amazon and say, allow Google or Amazon to communicate to the hub. So you might have to give permission on both sides of that handshake to say, let's enable communication. But at that point, Amazon or Google, as long as they're compatible with your hub, they suck in all the devices from the hub into their platform, and they say, okay, these devices are now voice activated. So, at least for your basic commands like turn things on, turn things off, set the level to this amount, it's almost like magic. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Kind of one of the cutting edge aspects of smart homes is facial recognition. It's not, people get disappointed by facial recognition because it requires so much computing processing power that it's not the instant response that people expect with sensors. And so there's facial recognition is likely going to be a cloud service, and that what I'm trying to say with facial recognition is that if you want your home to know who's in your rooms and do really custom automations, really advanced stuff, inevitably building a local network without any kind of cloud interaction is not going to work. So kind of the concept that I would like to introduce to you today is, well, you can start with a simple local smart home service that is custom built and custom specific and doesn't have privacy issues oriented with cloud services. But even the most local, the most secure smart home hub benefits from online interconnectivity, whether it's bringing in voice services or facial recognition, or even just remote monitoring. If you want to check in on your smart home when you're away from the house, inevitably you're going to have to bring in internet connection and cloud services to go along with that. And so the main thing that I'd like to learn from my mistakes when approaching a smart home project. When I got into smart home, it was because I was doing a off-grid luxury house, and the idea was, well, let's turn it into a smart home. And so it was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean every light switch and every room needs to have motion sensing and smart devices? Well, if you try and start off with a whole house conversion, it gets very complex very quickly. So a way many of the smart home enthusiasts are approaching this is to just add a few devices at a time, see where system stability gets you, and then build from there. That's not to say that you can't do a whole house innovation, but I'm not sure that many of the products are there yet, especially for local controls. So we're used to having our alarm systems be local. We install contactors, electrical sensors, and relays to see when doors are open and shut. And so a home security system right now is kind of a mechanical local system. If you want to have an equivalent local system throughout your whole house doing 10 times as many things, that's a little bit more complex, especially when you get into wireless communication. We're going to learn about all this stuff today, but keeping it simple is never a bad idea. The one area where I think builders are being a little short-sighted is window blinds. And I say this because there's smart lights and there's smart light switches and there's smart all these devices and stuff. But with window blinds in particular, you have to have a motor to pull these blinds open or down or up or side to side or roll them up or whatever. If you want to control window blinds, there has to be a motor there. Okay, high-end luxury homes might have motorized blinds. Motorized blinds, they cost, a couple $100s each. And so they're not for everyone. and we want smart home stuff to be for everyone. So maybe the window blind, motorized blinds doesn't get built into the house at this point. Well, then if there's no power out to the window blind and you want it to be smart, the only way is to bring power out to it. And so often what that means, like what IKEA does, is they'll put a motor, wherever the blind is being controlled, and then they run a battery pack off the motor. Well, if you want your windows to be opening and shutting every single day, that is going to drain the batteries. And so now you've created a new chore for your customer. Every couple of months, they need to go around their whole house swapping out all these batteries. And so how smart is that? That's not, IKEA, they also sell a solar panel that goes into the window and charges the battery, which runs the motor. And guess what? By the time you do all that, it starts to get really expensive. So, if you're budget constrained, you might say, oh, I'm going to skip the window blinds for now. And then you get this high-end smart home, but something that the customer actually really wants, which is window shade control, that gets blocked out of the smart home, and all of a sudden their smart house seems obsolete. So I think kind of one technology I'm really interested in is powered over Ethernet devices, where you're using the power, just a small amount of power coming from the Ethernet device to start up and power the device, but you also get the intelligence from it being Ethernet, where a computer at the other end of the Ethernet chain can send communication signals and relays. And so, right now, if you Google power over Ethernet window blinds, there's only one or two startups that are making them. But I think it's a very safe bet to say down the road, as the years come by, there's going to be more and more powered over Ethernet devices, particularly within smart home technology. So if you're trying to do like a future-proofing smart home design, just like in the solar industry where we would run conduit through the wall and up to the rooftop, even if we're not putting the solar array on the roof just yet, at least the infrastructure is there, and running some conduit through the wall and up to the roof is a relatively cheap practice to future-proof the home for that solar array. Running Ethernet out to where every smart home device in the house might be is the future-proofing way. Running your Ethernet cable out to every window in your house will say, okay, we're having regular window blinds now, but in the future, there's a Ethernet cable tucked away in the wall right there that we can access to plug it into a smart blind. I think that's a pretty good way to go about it. So not all the devices that we want are market ready yet. This is very much a hobbyist, do-it-yourself market, but the devices are coming to the market, and powered over Ethernet is a good way to do it. So in your home, in your kitchen, the concept of putting security cameras all over your house is weird. Like, I talk to a lot of retirees with smart home stuff, and they want the cameras outside of their home. They don't really want the cameras inside of their home. But actually, a security camera, even if the camera is just for security, the burglar is not there to rob the outside of your house. In most cases, they're coming into your home and burglaring the inside. So security cameras inside your home, while it might be an odd concept to us, you might be able to get away with fewer cameras if you have them inside your home. And then later, as the millennials age and even future generations come up behind who are so inundated with technology, who've never experienced the world without the internet, they're going to be much more comfortable with cameras inside the home doing things like facial recognition services. And that requires so much bandwidth and it requires so much speed that it is not a bad idea just to go crazy with your Ethernet and say, well, if I want, facial recognition triggering things in my living room or kitchen, uh, maybe we're not ready to implement that technology today, but down the road there might be a camera hovering over my stove top, helping me cook and turn the sink on and off. There might be a camera in the game room that recognizes who's coming into the room and turning on the TV and adjusting the lights based off that. The key is to run the Ethernet to all of those locations, even if you don't move forward with all those devices, so that the home is relatively future proof. Ethernet cable does not become so obsolete like other cables. I mean, especially when you're running, Cat 6 or Cat 5 rated cable. That it has enough bandwidth to support these cameras and devices without, even a good Wi-Fi network can do it too, but there's other the response times, overloading your Wi-Fi, the energy consumption, all of that is reduced when you use hardwired Ethernet. So for future proofing, hardwired Ethernet areas all over the place is a good way to go. Now, we're about to talk about some energy control devices, smart home devices, and the question is, don't overdo it. It's really neat to think that you could have a smart light switch that's wireless. The lights could be adjusting when you come in and out of the room. So could you get rid of the light switch entirely? No, National Electric Code does require at least one wall switch controlling the lighting and in a room. And I think the practical matter is, if your smart home network has crashed, if your smart home network has failed, you want a manual override just for the spouse acceptance factor. You don't want to, it's wonderful when a smart home can relocate a light switch without relocating the wiring, so that one light switch that's in a very inconvenient place you never have to use again. It's a little more complicated than that, but is this going to fundamentally change the way we wire our homes? We're still going to have light switches on our walls. Maybe we could have fewer of them, but we still will have that. So we got a couple of different, let's ignore that. We have a couple of different technologies we're going to review. Let's start off with light switches. I'm a solar guy, so I'm usually on the roof. I'm not doing the wiring inside the home. And light switches are a little bit complicated, because they're not smart. They're manual. They've created these manual tracks for the electricity to flow through, regardless of which switch you turn on the wall. So the way a three-way switch works, it has the power supply from the house, and it has these two traveler wires that the electricity either goes through one of them or it goes through the other one and then out the other side to the light bulb. And what that allows is both switches to turn the light on and off at different locations. So two switches turning one light bulb on and off through this kind of manual gateway, this manual control of where the electricity flows. When you install a smart switch, if you have one controller, where does it go? And for a lot of these behind the switch controllers, it's kind of fundamentally different than before. There is, the power goes into the controller, and then the power for the actual device comes out of the controller to the device. So we've removed the switches from the equation. So do you need light switches anymore to control a smart light bulb? No, actually you could, if code allowed us to, you could get rid of the light switches on the walls, but then, if this device ever fails, you're stumbling around in the dark without that manual override. So, if you really wanted to get into like optimal future home design, maybe you can just not overkill the three-way switches and just have one light switch in the room and not think about a light switch needing to be located by every single entrance to the room to control those lights. You could simplify the light switches. You don't want to get rid of them entirely. How this controller works is it has a separate feed to the light switch. And what you have to do is, normally there would be a wire going here. You might have to cannibalize this wire, take it off of the light switch on how you're doing it. You might have to take that and inside the electrical box behind the light switch, tap it onto your power supply to give you that always on power supply going to the controller. But it is retrofittable. You can retrofit three-way switches to a controller to control the light switch. What happens at this point is that the light switch forms a relay circuit. So there's a separate low voltage output, and the switch itself, when you're toggling it up and down, it's just causing voltage to flicker in this low voltage relay circuit, and that tells the controller that the user is toggling the switch on and off. But the actual power output is coming from the controller. It's no longer coming from the switch. So that's kind of interesting. In a way, that could lead to safety improvements in light switch design, because the actual power is further back behind the box and not at the faceplate of the switch. Not a huge issue. The point is, this is stuff that an electrician might be better at than if you're just not, if you're not already in electrical work. Some of this smart home stuff is actual electrical work, which should be done by an electrician. Now, I've tried out two different kinds of light switch controllers. The first is this kind of behind the box controller, where you just put it into this electrical, you take the faceplate off the light switch, so you take the switch off, you redo the wiring inside the box, and then you install this behind the light switch controller. The alternate version is a full switch replacement, and personally, even though I think maybe there's some better build quality options about this controller, you get a nice little indicator light, you get a nice little reset button. To actually access this thing, it's usually kind of squeezed in behind the box there, and they're very difficult to install. And you can run out of space in the box. Not always. An electrician is better at doing cable management and placement than a do-it-yourselfer. An electrician can probably locate this box there. National Electric Code says you can only take up 75% of the cross-sectional area of this box with stuff. There has to be 25% of it has to be empty space. So unless you do when I install these boxes behind the light switches, I'm getting them behind the switch, but then I'm also looking at that reset button and making sure that I can stick something in there and access that reset button, so that if there's ever a system failure and you have to re-add your device into your smart home network, you can access that button. It's in some ways It's more reliable than these switch replacements because this controller is effectively integrated into the back of this box here, and you can't really see what's going on. You might lose this reset button. You might be toggling the reset button by tapping the light switch in a series of codes, or they might put the button, down there. I have found the full switch replacement to be much easier to wire than the behind the box controller. Now, since we're on the topic, there's one device that we're not seeing on this list, which is an actual smart light bulb where the controller is built into the light bulb itself. And that's really interesting because it doesn't require any electricians to rewire these switches, so it's easier. The light bulbs are very expensive, but by the time you factor in the labor to put in this switch, they're actually, you might save a little bit of money using the light bulb. The problem with the light bulb in particular is that this controller needs to have an always on power input going into it. So if you have light switches on the walls, right by the room, and that light bulb that you're trying to control is a smart light bulb and not a smart light switch, someone comes into the room, flicks the light switch, and it turns the light bulb off, and then it won't turn back on again until it gets that power supply back on again. And so smart home users who have these smart light bulbs end up like taping over their light switches so that users don't actually use the switch anymore. So it's kind of, well, what style do you want? The behind the switch controller is more natural. It has less of a negative user experience. Now, the reason why the technophiles love the light bulb is twofold. The light bulb, A, you don't have to really be an electrician to wire. That's a huge advantage. And B, you get intelligence in the quality of the light itself. And so these color changing LED light bulbs can adopt circadian rhythm smart home algorithms. So in the evening, they take the blue out of the equation, and it's better for your sleep patterns to have a different kind of light as opposed to what the kind of light that like our television screens and stuff get out of us. That might be a little too far into the realm of Silicon Valley. What I'm trying to say is the smart light bulb, it's a very popular, easy solution, but if you have a bunch of light switches all over the walls and it's a popular light bulb in that room, you're going to run into issues with people turning the power supply off to the switch and therefore the light bulb not working, which you don't get with these always on behind the junction box switches. And so another thing is like, do you even really need, a light switch on the wall anymore? It kind of begs the question of, well, maybe you still have a manual light switch on the wall, but it's no longer in a particularly convenient place. Maybe you have all the lights in the room on one light switch panel that's in the middle of the room so that there is a manual override, but no longer at a convenient spot right by the doorway. That depends on how well automated your systems are. You can get wireless touch plates to connect to your smart home system. The more of these you install, the more complex your system gets. We don't really have time to go through all the nuances of it, but this is where voice command starts to come back in, is to say, what you really want to do to have a good light switch experience with smart homes is to get your light switches onto voice commands so that you can easily have that manual override. If someone so that you can just start using voice commands to turn the light switches on and off. That gets rid of the need for these kind of finicky, more advanced touch plates that are much more technically difficult because now you have to program them into it. So anyway, I all I'm trying to say is, voice commands for turning things on and off is a pretty natural fit. All right, so keep in mind, National Electric Code defines a qualified person as someone who has the skills and knowledge of electrical equipment and installation and has received safety training to recognize and avoid those hazards. So, by saying you have to be an electrician to swap out the light switches in your home, no, but you still have to know how to use a voltmeter and understand turning the breakers off so that you're not working on energized parts, as well as the importance of solid, secure, tight electrical connections without over torquing. It's not a simple task, and I think you're never going to go wrong with a battery project or a solar project or a smart home project by having maybe doing the design and material procurement on your own, but then having an electrician come out to do the install. It's just going to go faster, even though electricians are on the high end of the labor scale. The speed and technical proficiency at which they do their jobs usually means it's going to be the more cost effective outlet. You don't want to mess around with electricity. All right, so when I jumped into smart home, I saw a lot of battery powered devices with wireless communication. And it's like, great. So then, if this is wireless communication with a battery pack, then I don't need to worry about hardwiring all of these devices throughout the home. We can just come in and use batteries and have it all be wireless. The problem with that mentality is much more complex than meets the eye. It is not just a matter of battery replacement, although battery replacement is a big issue with smart home battery powered devices. And it's not every single device is going to experience these massive battery swappings. But this is an example of a sensor that is not just a motion sensor. It's also a vibration sensor. It's also a humidity sensor. It's also measuring how much light is in the room so that it can dim the lights according to your natural sunlight. There's a lot of sensing stuff that goes on. This vibration sensor basically gives it a anti-theft device. So someone removes it, it sends a vibration alarm. Well, do you really need all of that data transmitting 24/7 with a battery powered device? You might just be using a motion sensor as a motion sensor. And so I would say, if you're doing a battery powered wireless device and the choice is between a sensor that does the one thing that you need or a sensor that does the one thing that you need and 5 other things for the same price, the greediness of us says, well, I want the one that does 5 other things too for the same price. But that may not be the right tool for the job. It may be that unless you go in and fine tune all the other settings to say, don't sense those things or don't sense those things so often, you may not end up using those additional things, but they take up more energy, and that means you're swapping out batteries more frequently. So don't get distracted by multi-use devices. It's much better to choose the specific device for the job. Or alternately, all of these battery powered devices have little USB ports on them. So they can be, unless it's like a window sensor or a door sensor, something that moves and is detached from the wall. But like a motion sensor, it could be hardwired to a power supply. Or alternately, you use this USB port and just put a very, very large battery pack on it so that you don't need to swap the batteries out, so frequently. Battery powered devices for devices that are reporting and communicating all the time is not the default option. You're going to have a much better user experience hardwiring to a power supply all of your smart devices that you possibly can, and just leave the battery powered devices for those areas that you can't. The other problem is these wireless smart home devices, they rely on neighboring hardwired devices to do the heavy lifting with regards to communication. So they might communicate to a nearby hardwired device, and then that hardwired device sends the data, back home to the hub. And the danger of that is, if you just go with a wireless, non-hardwired wireless battery powered devices, they may not communicate, because you need to have at least a few hardwired devices to be those repeater stations. So, if you jump into smart home, you're like, hey, I'm going to retrofit my whole home, I can just do it with battery powered and wireless communication, you're going to have a bad time. You have to throw in some hardwired devices into the mix. In fact, I would recommend to always do hardwired powering as the default, if you have that option, rather than say, oh, I have the choice between a battery powered device and a wall powered device, I'm going to go with battery powered. That might be the easier install, but you deal with low battery issues, low battery errors, the device running out of power, not things that you want to go on in your smart home. And I think that plays into another aspect of quality, which is the more complex your home gets, the more using entry-level, cheap components inserts risk into the equation. So, we, on this off-grid home, we were budget limited. And so we chose lower end power electronics and a smaller battery than we should have. And the assumption was, well, this home, even though, the battery is there and it's an off-grid home, this particular home still had a grid connection. And so we were charging the batteries from the grid side and then running the whole house off the off-grid system, so that if there were a power outage, the home would still have power. And this client, while they spent a whole lot of money on this, off-grid living could cost a whole lot more. And so we were trying to squeeze, as much as we could into a small budget. And then it turns out that her LED light bulbs, because we had a relatively small lead acid battery, like a day's worth of power, not 2 or 3 days as you would in a true off-grid home, because we had lower quality inverter components, the charge currents from the solar array, and additionally it was an all electric home, so she has these wild swings in her load. The wild swings in the charge and the wild swings in the load results in some power quality issues, which showed up as LED lighting flicker on our house, which could have been completely resolved had they chosen, top shelf LED lights instead of bottom shelf LED lights. And the difference is, inside those LED lights, there's a capacitor which stores a little bit of electricity, and that's necessary because LED lights run on DC and our wall power is AC. So there's a little inverter inside these LED light bulbs with a little capacitor to store that electricity. And if that capacitor were just a little bit larger, it could have overcome the power quality issue. Because they put these low-end LED light bulbs throughout their whole house, we fired up our system. Some of their LEDs had voltage quality issues, and we had to go through a series of change orders and really kind of reconfigure our whole project philosophy, because no option was good at that point. Do you replace all the light bulbs in the house, or do you at that point start spending more money to upgrade the quality of the on-site power system? Where I really want on my next go around on smart home, powered over Ethernet LED lighting is kind of interesting. Is now in a smart home system, you in a high end, very complicated smart home system, you're going to spend more money on your Wi-Fi. You're going to have some other electronics you want to integrate together. Here's our server rack. This was my first time to put together a server rack. One thing that I would have done differently is we ran all the Ethernet into her basement, and then you can kind of in the back see us coming out the wall and then landing on our server rack. In the future, on the next build, I would put, they call it a patch panel. And so these Ethernet cables come and land on a dedicated panel, and then you use pre-made connectors to go from the wall to the switch. Now, my thought going into the project was, well, we're budget limited. We're trying to give her a whole bunch of stuff so we can just run the wires directly into the switch. And that's what someone who's not a fiber optic installer might recommend. An electrician would never recommend wiring a device from your light bulb and skipping over the electric service panel and just hard wiring directly into the grid. They have an electric service panel before that. It turns out these wall-mounted patch panels it's much easier during residential new construction to land all your cables on a wall-mounted plate and then to come back later and with your server room, rather than trying to do it all at the same time. It's just better for cable management. It ends up, you're spending more money on material, but it's much faster on labor and troubleshooting for that matter. We have a computer that we built down here to serve as her media center for her home, and that's where we hosted the smart home product. We also have kind of behind here, you don't really see it, but we have other computers that are all plugged in to her network. So her server's plugged into her switch. All these other, we had a separate computer for the video camera system plugged into the switch. A lot of this stuff is compartmentalized so that you don't need a very robust computer to do all of your smart home stuff, as long as you're buying, the associated hardware with top end security systems that come with their own processing computers. So the smart home system could just be very modest monitoring and controls. It doesn't have to be a full computer, as we'll talk about in a minute. One thing we did on this system that I thought was quite nice is we put it on a UPS system. So we went and we installed a power backup system to this server rack. And that means when we're switching the home physically, we have a manual transfer switch. When we're switching from off-grid to grid-connected homes, the home loses power, but the smart home system does not. And so that was kind of interesting to me, because it's like, well, for a very small amount of money, we can provide backup power to all of the smart home communication, the internet, the Wi-Fi, these security camera devices can keep on moving. And if we had power over Ethernet lights coming on down into this wall and running all our LED lights off our server rack as well, a UPS system in here could keep the lights on and keep the internet working. And then you can focus on other kinds of backup power elsewhere in the home. Eventually, we put a smart switch on the wall that powers the UPS and therefore powers the whole system, so that when we talk about energy management later, during times of high demand, we put this UPS system to work. During times of high demand, we take the the 1.5 kilowatts of server load offline and run it off the UPS for a few minutes and then reconnect it to help the off-grid home kind of skate over that period of high demand without any real sacrifice of the user in terms of their lifestyle. So I think that in residential home design, having a server room, having the server rack on a UPS, and then going with as many power over Ethernet devices as you can is a good approach to designing a smart home. So as far as some design principles, consider power over Ethernet. Run Ethernet to Windows and anywhere where there's going to be a smart device. Use hardwired power wherever possible, and then you need to have at least one light switch on the wall. Maybe get rid of 3-way switches, maybe get rid of 4-way switches. Simplify the lighting system, but don't eliminate it entirely. Let's talk about some Z-Wave platforms. We'll take a break at the top of the hour. Z-Wave platforms, it's weird because I thought that wireless was Wi-Fi. But there's actually other kinds of wireless communication. The front runners are Z-Wave and Zigbee. I thought, well, do you have to use Z-Wave or Zigbee? It turns out that the frequency of Z-Wave and Zigbee is actually an old protocol, not a new protocol. So Wi-Fi that we know of operates at a 2,400 megahertz or 2.4 gigahertz frequency. And then newer Wi-Fi is going up to 5 gigahertz. What does that actually mean? Well, those of us who are old enough to remember when telephones had hard wires into the wall, back in the 90s, early 90s, they transitioned from a hardwired phone with a cord to a cordless telephone at home. Still a home line, but now it didn't have the cord. And you could only go within 20 or 30 feet of that base station before the phone would drop. And then there was another technology where all of a sudden you could take that cordless telephone and walk anywhere you wanted in your house and the signal wouldn't drop. That frequency is around 900 megahertz. So Z-Wave and Zigbee are really just using kind of the same frequency that we used on old school cordless home telephones. So it's not a new frequency, and it's not necessarily a better frequency. I mean, Wi-Fi uses a higher frequency signal because it does not get good signal quality at lower frequencies. And you want your smart home device to have good signal quality. There's a lot of arguments in favor of Z-Wave and Zigbee. The lower the frequency, the less energy the signal is. So we're talking about battery swapping, and you're like, well, I want a low energy device because I don't want to swap out the batteries. But that's not the full story. Yes, you could get bad battery life on a Wi-Fi signal, but there's so many more other issues like how often the device is actually used. A motion sensor that is a security sensor in your garage that only works at night. A door window sensor that's sitting in your door window that you never use. The window that never gets open, but it still has its security sensor. Even at a higher frequency, the device isn't being used that often, so you're not going to have a huge drain on your battery. And so in what we were talking with the multi-sensors earlier, being able to fine-tune these sensors has more of an impact on their energy use than the actual frequency that they're using. So later we're going to talk about a security hub put out by a smart security system. And even though that hub has a Z-Wave or a Zigbee antenna, the security company for their own devices, they use a 2.4 gigahertz signal. So, mean, what does that tell you? I mean, there are reasons to choose Z-Wave or Zigbee. I think it's a good starting point. We're going to get into that after the break. But these aren't like cure-alls where you're doing something wrong if you're not using Z-Wave, if you're not using Zigbee, and you're only using Wi-Fi devices. I don't think that you can say that's wrong or a bad practice. The community's divided over this, but you get many advocates who just say go with Wi-Fi because it delivers a more stable, better communicative system. And then if you keep your battery powered devices to a minimum, then you don't have to deal with battery swapping. And so I don't think that that's a bad approach. So anyway, it's the top of the hour. We got a lot of room we need to make up, but let's take a 10-minute break. We're going to start back up at 10 after and get further along into the discussion at that point. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to be back at 10 after. So we're gonna pick up in a minute. Brian and Cernus, if you want to just say hello to log your attendance, that'll save us a little time. So we're gonna get started again. Just say, "Hey, I'm here." All right, great. So we're gonna keep going then, because we got a lot to cover. Are these networks secure? There's a couple of different ways to approach security. One is to install a high-end internet system and install a virtual network and put all the devices on their own Wi-Fi network that you can secure. But that's not perfect because even if you have a system for your home computer and then your smart home system is separate and isolated for it, at some point you may want to bridge those two gaps, and that does create a for that one connection point at least a potential security issue. One thing that I like about Z-Wave or Zigbee, even though I wouldn't recommend a whole house be Z-Wave or a whole house be Zigbee, but like with the context of an energy controller, you could have everything be on Z-Wave and then not need access to the customer's Wi-Fi at all. So it is possible to install these. One benefit of a Z-Wave or Zigbee system is that you might, in a corporate setting, you might have clients that say, "No way can your network touch our network." And with Z-Wave or Zigbee, you can still get wireless communication without touching the network. In a way, the Zigbee or Z-Wave is security through obscurity. The antennas are not powerful enough for Wi-Fi communication, and that means hackers who are trying to do actual damage to your system by stealing information and stuff, they're just not going to be targeting lower frequency antenna communication. One problem with Z-Wave or Zigbee is that while you can encrypt the communication, that encryption takes more bandwidth and data to adequately relay the signal. So, a large encrypted Z-Wave or Zigbee network is not tenable. And so for user experience, you often will ignore and not pair the devices in a secure mode. So, the Z-Wave or Zigbee is really security through obscurity, and keep security by keeping the devices off the network entirely. The alternate approach is to use Wi-Fi devices and a Wi-Fi router that is a little bit higher end, capable of setting up a virtual network. So the problem with Wi-Fi is it is a more powerful device in general, and so there's more of a hacking risk. The problem with Z-Wave or Zigbee is they're not inherently more secure than a Wi-Fi device. They're just they're physically limited to off network. So even if they were to be hacked, there's only so much that you can do by hacking one light bulb or light switch that wouldn't necessarily get you access to the broader computer system at large. So, these are just different design decisions to make. I think that's with energy controls in particular. You can come in and say, "We're going to implement energy controls on your system without touching your Wi-Fi." That's a strong, compelling sales point. But once the system becomes so complex, you may move over into other Wi-Fi devices. So let's move the conversation towards the pragmatic now. What makes a device smart? A thermostat's a great example. You can have dumb thermostats that don't do anything, but there's a thermostat on the wall and you dial the temperature up and down. Cheap, to the point, great for fiddling. Well, then you get a programmable thermostat, and a lot of people hate these because they're so clunky and difficult to program. But at the same time, my electric company offers a peak versus off-peak rate. So if I can program my thermostat based off time of day, I might not need the thermostat to be even any smarter than that to take advantage of their rate structure. Proprietary smart thermostats like the Nest may not have the functions that you need for your specific device. So the Nest, you can say, okay, well, I have different zones to program it for different times a day, but that's a lot like a regular programmable thermostat. You know, a smart thermostat to me is one that could communicate with your solar array to say, you know, when I'm producing power and my batteries are full, crank the AC. And then when I'm, you know, my batteries aren't full, I'm not producing power, to dial it back some. And the Nest it's not a solar oriented thermostat. And so you might need something a little bit smarter than the smartest manufacturer's smart thermostat. You know, a true smart device should do more than what it does out of the box by bringing in communication from outside devices. So a great example is with my smart thermostat. I don't want to have to program it for every single day of the week, every single day of the year, because my electric rate structure, it's not just weekends versus weekdays. The weekends also include federal holidays. And so instead of programming my thermostat for every single time period, for every single day, for the whole year, I run a script that says, detect if it's a weekday, a weekend, or a federal holiday, and then run lower energy, you know, higher energy use mode. And if it's during that peak rate, you know, run a lower energy use mode. And that is just not something that even the smartest manufacturer provided solutions are capable of. And so my smart thermostat, we're going to get to a couple of pictures of it, but it's just a step up in cost from a programmable thermostat. That additional cost is basically, it includes a Z-Wave antenna inside of it, and then I rely on outside software to provide these advanced controls. And you start to get really frustrated with high-end electronics that are proprietary, where you can't go and change the code to do what you wanted to do, because you get so liberated by these generic smart devices where you have control over the code, but you have to be very technical to get them to work. So let's talk through that technical process. You know, the first is we have to install a Z-Wave antenna, and we're basically telling our hub where on our computer our Z-Wave antenna is located. Now, do I know where this is located? No. You know, what I would recommend doing is sticking to solutions that everyone else is doing. You know, the smart home software that we are discussing in class today is commonly installed on a cheap $40 computer called a Raspberry Pi. And because I do mine on a Raspberry Pi, I can just Google, you know, what do I put in here, you know, for registering my Z-Wave antenna, and it's the same answer that everyone else who's doing the same solution has to come up with. If you're building your own computer and installing the hub, this solution might be a little bit different. You know, even so, sticking with similar computers to what everybody else is using will get you these answers. Otherwise, you really have to be knowledgeable with computers to open up a command line and run a command to see where all your USB ports are actually located digitally on their directory and put that pathway into here. It's not so hard to do, but I usually just Google and figure out what the answer is, and guess and check until it accepts it. One advantage of, you know, saying, well, of Z-Wave or Zigbee, though, is that Z-Wave and Zigbee devices are smart devices. You can buy a smart Wi-Fi device, but because it's a manufacturer cloud service, you're locked into their ecosystem. But just going onto eBay and Googling Z-Wave Plus thermostats, all of these are generic thermostats that I can be confident will come into my smart home system and be able to communicate with my smart home hub because they are thermostats that are for these smart home communication protocols. Whereas a Wi-Fi device, it might not be so open access. But just as an example, this is a interface that's provided by my Smart Hub, the Smart Hub software that I select, which is third-party software, but it gives me a digital interface that is similar to a Nest. So instead of having to worry about the clunkiness of programming a digital programmable thermostat, which these Z-Wave thermostats, physically resemble, all of the actual programming is done in a computer interface as well as the thermostat controls. You're now controlling it on your phone. But what I think is great is all of this advanced functionality does not come with the thermostat out of the box. So it's an example of the thermostat having added value after being included into a smart hub network. And I think that that's the spirit of smart devices, is that they're, just the hardware, and then the software solution adds value on top of that. So here's just some conclusions. I gave you the link to my online classroom and my email address. So if you want this handout after class, I'm happy to provide it to you. In the interest of time, I'm not just going to read the text on the screen. But one thing I was very impressed with my smart thermostat is after I plugged it into the system and then I went and added Google voice services to it, I could just say, okay, Google, set the thermostat to 75 degrees, and the voice services just magically work. It's pretty incredible when it happens, since it's not a voice command thermostat. It's a smart home thermostat that voice commands have been added into.
Like that device hasn't been set up yet. You can do that in the Google Home app.
You can hear my smart home system not liking me teaching smart home stuff in the background because it's listening to me. But, fundamentally, the Z-Wave antenna is a USB stick, and it plugs into the USB drive. This is a computer that runs our smart home network. Can really a $40 computer run your whole smart home network? And the answer is, it depends on what you want to do with it. If you want to keep it simple, yes, absolutely. Raspberry Pi is great for issuing, low energy smart home commands. It's also, it can issue those commands to off hardware computers. So if you're doing like a Unifi video camera system, it's already coming with its own computer. You don't need additional computer processing power. The Z-Wave communication, a lot of it's being done on this USB drive itself rather than the Raspberry Pi. And so, as you add hardware, a lot of that higher end hardware has processors and controls that do the heavy lifting of the system, whereas the smart home hub is really just a basic monitor. The one thing where the Raspberry Pi falls short on compared to an actual computer is hardware space. And so for energy controls, whereas I think that customers would have a better user experience if they're just using it as a control system. Energy use is high, so let's cut power to these devices, and vice versa. Once you add data logging to that, you're going to want to upgrade your storage space. So another common starting point for smart homes is to not go with the $40 Raspberry Pi, where then you have to buy the case for it and all that, but then just to start with a slightly more expensive mini PC. Both are popular options. So there's a couple of different smart home platforms out there. Google and Amazon make their own. Apple has their own. I use an open source software because it's free to download and use. And the one I use is Home Assistant. It's one of the top 10 open source projects out there. So it's a very popular thing. And literally you take the Home Assistant software, you install it onto the Raspberry Pi, you plug in a Z-Wave antenna. The Raspberry Pi has a HDMI port, it has a Wi-Fi signal, it has an Ethernet port. Maybe that becomes a security risk. In a commercial system, one advantage of using like a mini PC is you could eliminate the Wi-Fi signal. So that's a little bit more secure if you're going to be hardwiring the Raspberry Pi to your Ethernet anyway, then the Wi-Fi antenna is just sitting there useless. You don't need it. So in some ways, building a custom PC is the better way to go it. On enterprise level Raspberry Pi systems, you buy an upgraded Raspberry Pi board, and instead of having a Z-Wave antenna plugged into it, the chip that's inside here is actually hardwired onto the board already when you get into enterprise grade products. And that is more reliable than a failure point of the system becomes this USB connection. So let's go through the process of building a local energy controller. We're using the popular Home Assistant open source platform. It does not require access to the internet to function. Access to the internet gives it the ability for remote viewing, remote monitoring, integration with voice services, but it doesn't have to be integrated. It can run on its own without connection to the outside world. And I would just always on this stuff changes so fast that you don't want to use guides produced by people on YouTube, even when they're very good guides, because the software can change and the guide then becomes obsolete. So you always start with the official documentation. In the text, I sent out a link to my Discord classroom. I use Discord for my classroom because I also use it for Home Assistant, and then there's another community I use for building computers. This is like text messaging or chat rooms on steroids. There's just tons of people using this stuff, and it's a better and it's great for technical support, almost like going on a Facebook group where you have technical discussion going on amongst professionals. Discord, you get even better technical discussion amongst professionals if you have the right group. So we have some more information of that at the last slide of this program, but in short, if you just join my Discord chat, I can connect you to the right community if you actually want to try this on your own. But one of the first steps is to download the Home Assistant software, and there's different popular, whether it's the Raspberry Pi or slightly upgraded mini PCs, they give you the right software to download it, Then you have to make a boot disk. This is something that IT guys are well familiar with, but there's the way your computer starts up is there's a disk drive in it that has very primal computer code that says when energy starts flowing through me, I'm going to be able to send out some commands that tells the computer how to start up. It's not the hard drive where all the files are stored. It's its own little thing called a boot disk. It might just be a carve out of memory on your hard drive, but it's its own thing. So what we have to do is create a boot disk for our Raspberry Pi. So basically the software that you download is being downloaded onto a data card that then gets plugged into the Raspberry Pi, and that causes the Raspberry Pi, even though it's not a manufacturer smart home hub, it's just hardware. We're downloading software, putting it onto this computer and turning it on, and the software is compatible with the hardware. So to do that, we use a software called an etcher program. And what that traces back to is like, on a record player, there's actual, dimples etched into the record that are being read by the needle so that sound comes out of the record. And on a hard drive, those ones and zeros are physically being etched into that hard drive, and the computer needle is reading those ones and zeros, and that's telling it to turn on. So we use an etcher program to create the boot disk. And there's the same, your computer may already have an etcher functionality built into it, because your computer may have the ability to create boot disks and backup images. So instead of creating a backup disk for your computer, you download the software and put the Home Assistant software onto this backup disk, and then plug that backup disk into the Raspberry Pi, and it starts up. Enterprise grade software, you might have some memory built into the device itself so that you don't use an external data card for the boot sector. Here we're putting in the Wi-Fi password into the boot disk so that we don't have to program the Wi-Fi. It's just much easier if you just plug the Raspberry Pi directly into your Wi-Fi router and not try to give it Wi-Fi access from the get-go. And then all of a sudden you turn on the Raspberry Pi and it says, let's start up. Create your user account. We're connected to the internet, so we're pulling in information from the outside world. I think that's pretty fascinating, because one of those inputs is weather. And so you can actually create an energy system that knows the weather forecast. So if it calls for rain, or clouds the next day, even though it's sunny outside, you might go into an energy conservation mode, knowing that tomorrow the weather's going to be different. And that's kind of the thing about what a smart home hub does, is all the stuff that's plugged into it becomes a programmable data input. And so here we're connected to the network. Home Assistant is saying, hey, I noticed there's some Google Chromecasts on your network. Do you want me to pull these in? And that'll allow you to make automations based off Google Chromecast. So you can say, hey, Google, turn on my Roku TV, and it turns on. So this is just some basic stuff that's saying, okay, we recognize...
Turning on Roku TV.
So we recognize that there's some Chromecast devices.
Smart device. Ask me to turn on the specific device. Make sure you use the same device name as it appears in the Google Home app.
Okay, so we boot up Home Assistant. It's already detecting some Chromecast devices. We put in the directory to our Z-Wave antenna, and now all of a sudden we can register Z-Wave devices into our Raspberry Pi. Now there's some other things you need to do, like we need to tell the Raspberry Pi to store some energy data. And so we need a database. And so there's some additional kind of software add-ons that you have to add to the standard build for communication. This doesn't really mean anything to you until you get into actually doing it. But I wanted to create a little bit of a guide for what steps you're going in. So we are this InfluxDB is a database for storing the energy data, or really the data from the smart home system. And some of the finer tune elements might be that you don't want to store all of the data. So you might have to program this database to only bring in certain devices and not all the devices, so that you don't fill up your memory card and crash the system. But basically it's usernames and passwords. So you're creating usernames for the database, passwords for the database. This is visual display software for the database. Again, it's open source. You're not having to buy this stuff, but you have to say, okay, my smart hub needs a database. My smart hub needs a way to display the data. And then my database needs to talk to the display software. So here we're in our display we're setting up our database. We're setting a username and password. And then basically, we're selecting display software and database software by swimming with the same school of fish. So everyone in Home Assistance is using InfluxDB and Grafana, so we're doing it too. That means there's a lot of users in our technical support group that can walk you through this startup process. And then that's it. So once you know what you're doing, setting up a Home Assistant Smart Hub, can be done in a half an hour or less. It's just it makes a good weekend project. If you don't know much about computers, to go through that same process can take you a full day, just because you don't know what you're doing. So if you buy all the parts, you go and join the Home Assistant Discord group, you're going to get a lot of help to walk you through that process. So what do you get for doing that? Well, now we have smart home software, and most smart home software, whether it's Home Assistant or something else, will tell you, okay, here's our device management menu, here's our automation menu, and that's the main thing. We're going to pay attention to this automation menu because we want to create some energy automations for our Z-Wave devices. And so just one example is now for programming the thermostat. The thermostat is now a device in our smart home system which knows what time of day it is. So we say, okay, we're going to create a thermostat system to turn the thermostat off between 6 and 8 a.m. And so we have a trigger. That trigger is a time trigger, 6 a.m. Conditions will override the trigger. So you may go and put a condition in here that says if it's a weekend, if it's a holiday, then don't trigger the automation. And that way, instead of programming for every single hour, every single day of the week, you say no weekends, no holidays, and it's all done for you. I mean, it's once you understand the technology, it should be saving you time, not costing you time. If you are finding that you're having to troubleshoot too many things, you've probably overextended yourself on making your network too complicated. But see, we've set in our trigger, we've set in our condition, and so now we say a device. And this device is our thermostat our Z-Wave thermostat. I haven't programmed in any of this stuff. It's just the smart home software has sucked in this data and said, oh, we have a thermostat, and this is how the thermostat just naturally appears. And so we say, well, we want to turn the air conditioner off at 6 a.m. and coast until 8 a.m. because I have a peak electric rate from 6 to 8. So I say, okay, well, I'm going to change my thermostat mode to off for 2 hours, and then I'm going to turn it back on again. And that's a very basic, simple energy automation. Now, once that's up and running, I might go back and say, okay, well, instead of doing just a on-off automation, I might adjust the temperature setting on the thermostat instead. So there's more complexity in these menus than meets the eye. You have the ability to all the way to writing custom scripts, which might be eventually your automations get so complicated that scripting is better. But for basic stuff, the automation menu is more than what you need. Okay, well, now we want to start creating some advanced functionality. We don't, if I'm living off grid, it doesn't matter what time of day it is. It's more like, my home load is bouncing up and down, and then my solar power supply is more constant. And what I want to do is kind of shove as much energy as I can into my solar window to reduce the strain on my batteries. Likewise, if my battery inverter only has a 2 kilowatt power level, I want to be able to turn off devices when my home load exceeds the capability of my system and turn those devices back on during off-peak times. And that's a design issue not just for off-grid homes, but also commercial businesses where their electric bill is based on the maximum height of the load rather than the energy underneath it. And so now I don't just need a thermostat that can turn the air conditioner on and off. I need to understand the energy consumption of the home. But from that point, there's devices that could turn on and off to manage your energy load behind the scenes that don't impact the usability of the home, such as a dehumidifier. If you live in a humid environment and you have a dehumidifier that's always on, it doesn't have to run 24/7. It can run 22/7. And we just turn it off at very peak times of consumption. So the way we do that is we have a smart plug that is turning the air conditioner on and off, and we have an energy sensor inside our service panel that's telling us how much energy our system is using. And we're going to talk more about that as we go. And this is where it starts to get real interesting, because you could have one deep freeze with all your frozen food in it, or you could have two deep freezes where half of the deep freeze is just gallon jugs of ice, and then the top of the deep freeze is just your cold storage. And having two deep freezes that are storing half the food is going to use a little bit more energy than just having one deep freeze with all the food. But by being able to freeze these blocks of ice during off-peak times and turn the deep freezes completely off during peak times, what we're doing is trading expensive energy for inexpensive energy. That might be commercial demand management. That might be getting more devices to be powered off of the same output, whether it be a generator or a solar battery. But load shifting is one thing that electric controls can do without getting you into expensive battery, real chemical battery purchasing. And so this device right here is a 40 amp, 240 volt controller that can do an electric tank water heater. Electric tank water heaters can comprise, a 4 kilowatt load. So being able, and the water inside your electric tank is sitting there; it's not going anywhere. So by turning what we're doing is we're turning the electric tank water heaters off during peak times and turning them back on during off-peak times. We're going to get into those advantages in a little bit. So a smart hub is the software that controls all of these smart devices. You don't just have to have one smart hub on your house. You can have multiple smart hubs, and then some smart hubs will communicate with other smart hubs. So, for example, there's a security system out there called Abode, which markets itself as a do-it-yourself smart computer system. And they have an automation menu, and they have their own devices, and they actually have Z-Wave and Zigbee products compatibility. But it's actually not so simple as just having Z-Wave or just having Zigbee. There are software version compatibilities, and maybe 5% of these Z-Wave and Zigbee products have some code issues that need to be massaged by the smart hub in order for them to have all their functionalities, like a light switch that's not just on and off but has a sliding function, may need to have some additional scripting built into it. So Abode, even though it has a Z-Wave and a Zigbee antenna, it's not compatible with all Z-Wave or Zigbee devices. Whereas something that's open source, like Home Assistant, the the strength of Home Assistant is there's tons of programmers contributing tons of code to this. So like an open source smart hub based on Home Assistant is going to be compatible with almost every smart device on the market, whereas a more specialized hub, a proprietary hub, a hub that's put out there by a third party, will be more restrictive, and you'll be more reliant on that third party to do the programming for you. And there's also some security issues where like you have to pair the device directly with the security hub to trigger the security alarm. So a smoke alarm that is outside of the security hub may not be able to trigger the security hub. It may be able to be paired directly to the security hub. Now, that said, the security hub can still send its communication outward. And so when I use Abode, I have all of my security system on the security hub, and then Abode talks to Home Assistant, and all of my devices on the security hub then get sucked into Home Assistant. So I can kind of have my cake and eat it too. And so the Raspberry Pi, it makes a good smart hub, but it still might be assisted by external hardware to do heavy lifting for things like video processing and video cameras and security systems and stuff like that. What makes a good smart device for energy control? Well, it's a device that can turn on and off, and if it just by the power in the wall turning on and off. And so if I have an electric kettle and I go at night and I turn the little switch into the on position, but it doesn't have any power, it just stays that way. And as soon as it gets power, the electric kettle turns on. And so that allows me to set up my electric kettle at night, and then in the morning when I wake up, I have hot water for coffee. A dehumidifier, not all dehumidifiers are the same. Some of them, if they lose power, you have to go and press a button to get them to turn back on again. So your electric tank water heater doesn't have that. It just naturally starts working when it has power, and then if it loses power, it turns off until it gets power again. Some dehumidifiers, not all dehumidifiers are equal. The only way for energy management for a dumb device to become a retrofittable smart device is for it to be really dumb, which means if it has power, it's working, and if it doesn't have power, it's not working. If you have to press an on-off button, you can't kill the power and refeed the power over and over and over again and have it just be working naturally. So how do you add these devices to your smart hub? Well, there's a mode that's called inclusion mode. And we talked about earlier how sometimes you have that communication be encrypted or not. Certain smart devices like door locks, alarm systems, they require an encrypted communication. The door locks you actually have to get within a couple feet for them to pair physically. So it prevents drive-by sniffing. And so like what I use is I have my Abode system doing all of my encrypted devices and then communicating those device statuses to Home Assistant. And then all the other devices in the smart home are unencrypted and then just paired directly into Home Assistant. Abode says, even though we have a Z-Wave signal, all of our proprietary sensors are on a Wi-Fi bandwidth. They just use their own Wi-Fi bandwidth and not the home's Wi-Fi. They provide their own Wi-Fi. Smoke alarms, there are Z-Wave smart smoke alarms. Again, hardwired is better. But do you need every smoke alarm to be smart? There is a device that's just a listening device that listens for smoke alarms going off in your house and triggers the alarm that way. So, what I have found is that the consumer, if you ask them, they'll want to know where the fire is breaking out. You have a fire in your upstairs bedroom, you can only get that resolution with a smart smoke alarm. That said, if something happens to your smart network and you have to reset everything, then you have to go and reprogram every smoke alarm in your house and re-include it and repair it back into your smart hub. And that becomes problematic from its own user experience. And what happens more, that you have a crash of your smart home network or that you have a fire breakout in your house? More likely you're going to have a crash in your smart home network. And so by picking smart smoke alarms instead of dozens of smart smoke alarms instead of a handful of listening devices, you may be creating more chores for your maintenance and upkeep than you need to. So you get what you pay for. Can you have just buying all the smoke alarms in your house be smart and that's all you need to do? Yes, but spending more money on devices that all they do is listen for smoke alarms, even though that might seem silly, it's going to save you programming time and setup time. And actually, I believe the Amazon Echo has smoke alarm listening as a beta feature. It's kind of interesting. Okay, Home Assistant, right off the bat, it does store some data, but not a lot. So it'll give you kind of a 24-hour view of your energy use. But if you want to go back a few days, then you need to set up a data logger. So that becomes a system complexity issue. Customers want their data logged, but they also want their systems to work, and they may be budget constricted. So what I would like to kind of have you think about is, yes, energy analytics are really good, but as a low-end starting point, getting rid of the data logging and just having a little bit of data stored is going to deliver a better user experience. And finally, there's cloud services for data logging, so that if you have internet access, you may not need to store this data locally. A lot of, in the solar industry, installers get very frustrated with online solar monitoring because that data is not available locally. But the online monitoring companies say, look, if we're storing all this data every single day, every 15-minute period for 3+ years, eventually that could crash the system because your memory cards fill up and then it starts to make the computers go buggy. So we don't provide that data logging because we don't want to have to deal with the technical support for data logging. So, if you're running off a Raspberry Pi, you're not going to do robust data logging. You would have to start out with a mini PC, a more robust computer with a very large hard drive so that you don't have to worry about it. The consumption meters go inside your electric service panel. This is something that you could do yourself, but you really have to understand and respect electricity to open up that panel of your electric service panel and hook these conductors around the feeds coming into your home. So it's not that it can't be done, but electricians understand that even if you turn off the main breaker to your panel, these terminals up here are still hot. The underside is dead, but the top side is still hot. And so, paying an electrician to come out to your house to do a couple hours of work, including taking the service panel off and putting this inside the service panel, is not a bad idea. National Electric Code allows this equipment to be installed inside the service equipment, provided that your equipment, the general rule is the total area of all this stuff cannot exceed 75% of the cross-sectional area of that space. And that's front to back, that's side to side. So you have to have a 25% gap from that way, and then also in terms of depth. NEC 2020 also requires a physical barrier Now, whether that's the case for the equipment or not, I haven't seen many inspectors really making that judgment call. But this thing could be located inside the service panel. It's not a bad idea to locate it outside the service panel as well. It just results in a little bit of a clunkier control room. But in terms of planning your electric service panels now, putting a in-wall junction box with a bunch of space right next to your current service panel is a very good idea. Here's the Sense energy monitor. They use a Wi-Fi signal, and it's just drawing power right off the service panel itself. So here's these rings, and the actual orientation of which way these clamp on is important, and that's part of your service instructions. But the same tool that an electrician uses to clamp around these wires to monitor current, is now being captured and collected by this sensor. So here's our energy monitor sensor inside the service panel. This is actually that's what the electric tank water heater is on. And then the energy meter, you run it through its pairing process, and there's little buttons on these things. And this one, you actually have to unscrew the lid and press the button. On this one, the button's on the back. And so, keeping them outside the service panel, maybe in a junction box, prevents you from, if your system crashes, having to take the service panel back off and press these buttons and putting it back on again. So from a user management, a lot of users, I would not recommend they work inside their service panel. And even if the state law allows them to, new construction, having an additional box for this service equipment to be located will increase your professionalism of your install. So the energy meter just magically shows up after you run through the pairing process, and then it becomes an input on the automation. So now instead of time of day, it's when the energy meter reads more than 6 kilowatts of power, turn off the electric water tank. And that means you can, in the past, you have not been able to run your whole house on a Tesla Powerwall. The power output's been too small. In the past, you've needed a 20 kilowatt or 25 kilowatt generator to run your whole house, even though your house is normally pulling 3 to 5 kilowatts because of the event of all the devices turning on at the same time. Now we're sensing current, voltage, amperage of the service panel, as well as individual devices, and we can use software to prioritize those devices. Now, this stuff gets messy. All of these inputs are being sucked into the hub. Generally, you have to go through and relabel all of these devices so you know what device is doing what. And so you're doing that relabeling process as you go. A lot of the upgrades to Home Assistant over the past few months have been to make this relabeling process easier, because that was one of the big time wasters, is having to relabel everything so that it turns out nice and neat on the user display and doesn't have the manufacturer provided labels, which are usually much longer and they don't display so well. But now we have our monitoring interface, and to say, I want to know what my home power is, we just say, well, I have the energy meter. It's show me the main energy amount, and it tells us all this associated data with it. Now, one thing that's nice about, so usually, well, we already talked about this, this is just more on data logging. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over it. Your smart home software has areas that you can program into. You can start and restart the server. I kind of want to end, this is just more views on inside the code. So here we're actually having to program the database software with our username and password so that it can store the data that's being fed into the software. A little bit daunting, but actually this is the code is not so complicated that it's inaccessible. This is not PHP. This is just very simple device to device communication, so it can't be that complicated. If you have kids at home who are in high school or middle school, they should be able to just go in and figure this stuff out for you. Permissioning is important, but in the interest of time, I want to kind of end on some programming notes. So this is just system configuration where we're telling the system to provide us with only the data that we need. Only give us the watts of the system rather than every single piece of communication to take off some of the load, the bandwidth that Z-Wave is capable of providing. Z-Wave is like a 56K modem. It's only capable of relaying so much data, and the energy data, we want to have it be very granular. And so I think a Z-Wave network that's just dedicated for energy-related devices is a natural fit. You can transmit that data wirelessly without Wi-Fi access. So I apologize. We are going to go over on time. You've already logged your attendance, and so if you have to get out of here, that's fine. But we're probably going to go about 5 minutes over. You could edit the code there's the visual interface, and then there's the code behind it. So sometimes editing the code, it just goes faster. So let's talk about economics for 5 minutes, and then we'll conclude. The Raspberry Pi with some energy monitors and Z-Wave sensors and smart plugs, it might run you $350 in material, and then by the time you hired someone to program it and install it, you're looking at still under $1,000 for some basic energy monitoring and controls. And then, of course, on the commercial side of things, it can go way more expensive, but there are higher amperage smart components. The largest one that I know of that's listed is 40 amps, and it does 120, 240. But then on top of that, there's Z-Wave devices that could just trigger relays and contactors for more commercial involved projects. In my area, I have a time of use rate where normally I'm paying 9 cents a kilowatt hour. My time of use rate for 2 to 3 hours a day, it quadruples my electric rate. And for the rest of the day, it reduces my electric rate by half. Which is pretty interesting because if I can keep my energy use just level, if I could take those 2 to 3 hours of peak energy use and keep them at the average energy use for my home with my provider's time of use rate, I'm going to save 5% on my electric bill by doing relatively little. And if I can push my electric tank water heater to the off-peak time, if I can dial back my air conditioner to the off-peak time, if I can turn my dehumidifier off during the peak time. Now, we're not talking about controlling every single device in the house. 2 or 3 devices, $350 of material, $500 of labor and programming. I can do way more than just average energy use during that peak time. There's energy software out there for modeling these savings. So Energy Toolbase is a commercial software where you can input all of the energy use components of your home or business and model real economic spreadsheets that would make a CFO smile to do this. I use it more for commercial demand management, but it's useful to know about. Here we're modeling the time of use rate structure. most of the utility rate structures in the United States are plugged into Energy Toolbase. I live in Mississippi, so we're always exceptional circumstance. But here I'm just modeling my demand input, and I'm saying, okay, well, I'm making, if I don't have this data, I have to make some assumptions. So I'm taking my energy bill and I'm saying, okay, if I can just have average energy use, I can save this amount. But if I really deplete my time of day rates to be 1 to 2% of my daily energy use, I could save from my normal electric bill, with standard load shifting versus extreme load shifting, I might be able to save $500 a year. So implementing a small smart energy control system on a standard residential household with a peak versus an off-peak rate structure, you're looking at 2 to 3 year paybacks. The commercial applications of energy demand management are far more valuable than residential, because commercial customers are billed by the kilowatt. I don't know where y'all are located, but say in Atlanta, Georgia, they actually allow their residential customers to have commercial type rate structures that are not billed by the kilowatt hour, but are instead billed by the kilowatt, not the energy under the curve, but the maximum height of the curve, is how 30 to 70% of a commercial electric bill is calculated. And if you're one of those commercial customers where 70% of your electric bill is demand charges, that is an extreme rate. And if you can kill your electric water heaters and other continuously operating but non-essential devices, if you can kill those devices during your peak, you can save a lot of money. And so if a 140 amp smart relay costs, between the material and the labor, $200 each to install, and you can't just take all of that energy and kill it. Realistically, you might be only able to shift half of it or less. But even running at a 40% system efficiency, if I install 10 units at $200 each, and that's a $2,000 project, and my demand charge is modest. So sometimes the demand charges can be twice that. Most customers on demand charges are around the $10 range. If I'm saving 10 kilowatts a month and I install 50 kilowatts worth of load management devices and I'm operating at a 40% effectiveness, I'm saving $200 a month. When I'm saving $200 a month on a $2,000 project, commercial demand management load control projects can have less than a 1 year payback. And that is almost a guaranteed project. You could do a $20,000 project, get a capital equipment loan, and have the cost savings pay off the loan quite easily with commercial demand management. And so the fundamental premise, and then we're going to get out of here, is like, here's a hotel, and the hotel is full of 5 kilowatt, 40 amp, 120, 240, and they're actually just 240 air conditioning units. And all these air conditioning units are turning on and turning off and turning on and turning off. Well, if we use smart home load control to say, okay, well, we're going to cycle these units so that they're still always on, except they're not running at the same time. What that means is, for the same amount of air conditioning, the same amount of energy, but just prioritizing them to smooth out our peaks, that rearrangement of our on-site energy use reduces the demand, reduces the kilowatts, and that reduced demand is where the bulk majority of commercial electric savings lie. And that's the real opportunity with this stuff is reducing demand charges on commercial buildings. And so there are commercial products out there that are doing this, um, making smart electric service panels. At the residential level, the problem is that the Tesla Powerwall can only provide 5 kilowatts of output power, which is not enough power under normal circumstances to run the whole house. In fact, it's only enough power to run your air conditioner or everything else. And being from the South, the last thing I want to lose during a power outage is my air conditioner. I'd rather go without internet rather than be sitting around in a 100-degree home. And so the Tesla Powerwall by itself is just not good enough for whole house power backup. And so there's smart home load control companies that are quite expensive that will help you run your whole house off 1 or 2 Tesla Powerwalls. The same thing could be said for backup generators. And then you get into commercial levels to say, your backup generators on a commercial building are not powering the whole building. Doing some load control can let those generators power more devices off of the same generator. So, these smart home devices, they're full of those circuit monitors that get wired into the board. They are boxes that sit alongside the electric service panel, and they might have smart relays inside them. But basically, there's smart devices now where you can buy the individual components and start piecing them together yourself, and it makes a great rainy day weekend, COVID-19 social isolationism response. So that's pretty much it. Sorry for running a few minutes over, but there's a lot of information to cover. You have my email address. You have an invite to my Discord channel. So if you want to join my Discord group, you can get some follow-up information. I'm happy to provide you with a recording of this program as well as the handout. So shoot me an email after class. Other than that, are there any questions for those who have stuck around? All right. Well, again, you're more than welcome to the course recording and the handout. Just join my Discord group. Discord is really fun, and it will help you if this is actually something you want to do. Get technical support from random kind strangers who actually know what they're talking about. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jerry, and thanks for tuning in.